Good morning, everybody. How is everybody today? So my name is Jonathan Kaplan. I'm a senior policy advisor and researcher at the Learning Policy Institute. For those of you who are not familiar with the Learning Policy Institute, we are an organization that's been around for a decade. We focus on high quality research to improve policy. I'm sure some of you are familiar with our work. I've been at the Policy Institute for about 2 years now. Prior to it, I worked for 17 years at an organization called the California Budget and Policy Center, where I focused on state budget issues and education finance specifically. But I also have background as an educator. I worked for 10 years in classrooms. I was keenly interested in multilingual education. I was a bilingual educator. And so I sort of say that I was in the trenches and now I'm flying at 40,000 feet. And so that's sort of my background and where I come from. And I have a keen interest in improving education in the state and feel very fortunate to be working at the Learning Policy Institute, but also really very fortunate to have had the opportunity to do this work for getting down to facts and feel honored to be able to be a part of such an esteemed group of researchers. So with that, what my purpose here is to sort of do the big picture look at sort of California education finance with a certain sort of lens. Oftentimes, I think we focus on how much schools spend and focus on sort of things like rankings, where is California related to other states. And the previous Getting Down to Facts work looked at adequacy studies. How much would it cost to do this, right? But we sort of were looking at the beginning, we were like, well, there isn't an adequacy study, but I think one of the elephants in the room, frankly, is where does the money actually come from? Like we talk a lot about how we spend it, how it's allocated, but not a lot of attention is paid on where the revenues actually derive from. How do we actually get the money to begin with? And so this study is sort of looking at that question and thinking a little bit more specifically about how it would be that we would try and think more expansively about revenue, as opposed to thinking that we're just in this static place that we cannot move, which is, I think, oftentimes the place that I think people think we are. So, where funding comes from, why it is that that funding lacks stability, and what can be done to improve it. Like, what are the standing places in which we would think about those issues? So that's what the report is focused on. Now, when we talk about revenue in the state of California, one of the things that really you need to think about is that there are a fair amount of constraints. I wouldn't suggest these are immovable constraints, but it is important to understand those constraints in order to be able to understand the revenue system as a whole. State policymakers and voters have created a bunch of constraints over the years. There are constitutional constraints that exist in our state constitution. There are also statutory constraints. The distinction being constitutional constraints, you got to go to the voters to change it. Statutory constraints, you can actually change in the legislature. There are rules around that, but those are the two basic ways you think about constraints. Now, our report details how the policy choices that policymakers have made have led us to where we are today. And among those constraints are many that have restricted state and local government, not just how the state government is raising or getting money, but also how local government is raising money. So we're focused on, the big one that we all know about is Prop 13, but I'll just do a brief primer. Prop 13 is about 50 years old now. We have a half century of this proposition. The proposition basically limited local property tax rates to 1%, and then also limited the reassessment of property value over time. So that created a tremendous constraint on local revenue raising in the state of California, right? The other thing that Prop 13 did that not necessarily everybody understands is that it also limited what the state could do. It put a 2/3 voting requirement in the state legislature, in both houses of the legislature, to increase revenue across the state. So that also created a constraint that was quite significant at the state level. It's sort of seen as the third rail of California politics, right? It's sort of like you can't change this. But in fact, actually, there have been some attempts to try and change it. And I'll talk to you a little bit about sort of what it is that Prop 13 provides. Now, there is an additional constraint that was put in the state constitution in 2010 that made it even more difficult. It basically doubled down on Prop 13. What it did is it said, one of the things Prop 26 did is it said, in order to raise a tax on any individual or any taxpayer in the state of California, you had to have a 2/3 vote. Now, why is that important? Prop 13, you could actually raise taxes on some, reduce taxes on others, become a revenue neutral tax, and you could change the composition of taxes in the state of California. Prop 26 made that impossible. Now, if you raise a tax on a single individual in this state, a single taxpayer, a single business, it's a 2/3 vote of both houses of the legislature. So that's Prop 26. Now, in addition, there are statutory constraints. Those two are examples of constitutional constraints. Statutory constraints, we have statutory constraints going back for a century in this state. For example, the sales tax in the state of California was invented in 1933. It taxes tangible goods. What's a tangible good? You got to hold it. You got to have it, right? But if you tax something like a digital product, or you tax something that is intangible, like sales of services, a lawyer selling a service to an accountant or the vice versa, that is not taxed in the state of California. So we have that statutory constraint up until the Prop 13, Prop 26 era. You could change those around, but now if you raise a tax on a single individual, Prop 26 says you have to have a 2/3 vote to change that sales tax rate, right? Now, what are the impacts of these constraints? What does it actually mean for people out in the field? Well, the constraint, the reality is that for schools and for what's happening across the state, I think many of us understand some aspect of this, and we talk about capacity, but there's not a lot of talk about money. Capacity is often driven by resources, right? The revenues that we have. And, California school districts are still struggling quite a bit, even in a very robust revenue environment. I mean, we are at high mark levels of revenue like you have not seen. And yet, if you look across the state, there's still quite a bit of challenge for school districts, right? And so, what does this look like? California staffing ratios, some of the highest in the country. We got 40% higher teacher to student ratios in California than the national average. We have revenue constraints, meaning that services, the other one that's not really paid attention to enough, I think, especially amongst the education community, is that services for families, not just for schools, right? The families of our kids that are going to school oftentimes have especially for the lowest income families in the state, are oftentimes in real challenge, in large part because there's not enough resources in the system to support the resources that we would want for families in that situation. So in addition to creating negative, real challenges and limits and impacts for school districts and families, the other thing that happened out of the constraint environment that Prop 13, Prop 26, other constraints led to is a real change in the way that California funds schools. So what you're looking at here is a diagram that basically breaks down how a local educational agency, i.e. a school district in the state, all the way on the right gets its money. Where does it come from? There are three basic places, either the state, which is the yellow portion of the chart, local government, the pink portion of the chart, or the federal government, the blue portion of the chart. This is how an LEA gets its money, how a school district gets its money. 60% of the money comes from the state. 35% comes from local government, and about 5 to 10%, depending on the year, sometimes a little higher, comes from the federal government. Now, if you just look at the state, what you'll see is that 95% of all state revenue, which is really where the story is, comes from one of three taxes. 95% comes from the personal income tax all the way on the left, the corporation tax, or the sales and use tax. 95% of all dollars flowing to the state government that comes to an LEA. Now, that means that the state's economy is the key driver of what happens for school districts, and most importantly, as relates to revenue, personal income taxes. So we have a highly dependent revenue situation on personal income tax. That is not something that has been the way forever. It's increasingly become so, and it creates a volatile environment for schools because personal income taxes, which, by the way, are driven largely by those who have lots of revenue and lots of income, is volatile. We are in a robust environment right now. We are a moment away, frankly, I don't mean to be a doomsayer, but an AI bubble bursts, and next thing you know, you'll have 2 to 4 to 5 years of a terrible economic environment for schools. But we don't think about it when things are going well, right? So what does this look like? Well, what it looks like over time, this is a chart that shows you what it looked like 50 years ago versus what it is today in terms of the breakdown of that state general fund revenue. This is just that yellow portion of the chart, right? The yellow broken down over time, 50 years. Back 50 years ago, prior to Prop 13, sales and use taxes is the yellow line on the chart. If you look all the way to the left, the predominant source of revenue for the state was sales and use taxes. Personal income taxes were below it. And if you go 50 years forward, it's a flip. What happened is sales and use taxes are now half of what they were 50 years ago, and personal income taxes are double where they were 50 years ago. Now, why is that? Well, sales taxes, if you're just taxing tangible goods, what ends up happening over time, the growth in our economy is in those business-to-business services, lawyers and accountants and tax preparers, all the things that we think of in terms of services, right? Whereas, digital goods being sold through the roof, but you can't tax digital goods, right? Whereas you could tax personal income taxes. We have had actually I would say it's a good news picture to have personal income taxes as part of our revenue makeup, right? Because if you have and we have a progressive personal income tax, that is, rates are higher as you earn more money. So those things are good, but it creates a certain environment for revenues in the state. And we think of it as immovable, but I would suggest it's not. Now, what this general fund instability based on personal income tax means is that we have a legislature that is inhibited from making ongoing investments. Even in a very robust, that is today, revenue environment, huge amounts of revenue, there's some reticence to put money into ongoing spending. Why? Because tomorrow it could go away. Now, why? We're setting up a revenue system that creates certain dynamics that mean that there's likely to be more one-time spending. Things like, I'll use the example that doesn't actually prove the rule. The community schools program was a one-time spending event. We just actually had a huge, significant success in the state of California to put $1 billion of ongoing money into community schools. But that was a Herculean lift, frankly. So to be able to make one-time spending ongoing, to actually make ongoing investments, capacity as we call it, in the school system, you need to have a revenue system that allows for it. Now, what we talk about in the report, there are some principles of what you would want to have in a revenue system. Adequacy, the ability to actually support the system, the programs and services you want in an economy and in a state budget program. Reliability, you want to make sure that it isn't going to go up and down all the time. Fairness, you would hope that it actually takes more from those that have the ability to pay more and does not burden those that have less. Neutrality, two similar taxpayers. For example, a homeowner on one point and another homeowner, another point that have the exact same house that are paying hugely different tax rates, right? Because of Prop 13. Simplicity, you want to make it easy for people to understand. One of the reasons is, if it's a complex system, what that means is that those with greater resources will be able to navigate it easier. And it makes it less likely that people will trust and think it's accountable to everybody, that we all believe in the revenue system. So these are some principles we talk about in the paper. And what we're also talking about is options. What can we do about all this? Why is it that we think of this and sometimes just don't even actually think about it? Because it's just there. We don't really even consider what it would be to change the revenue system. One thing we point out in the paper is to say we would want to try and employ revenue sources that focus on long-term adequacy. Not just adequacy in the next few years, adequacy over the next generation or 5. In other words, revenue streams that grow, ability to think of it in an adequate way over time. Now, one of the ways to do that is to sustain the current progressive personal income taxes that we have, right? So we have a personal income tax structure that is quite progressive. That is not inherently a problem. The problem is if you're only dependent on personal income taxes, then it goes up and down, you got an issue, right? The other would be potentially to establish the same sort of tax revenue system for corporations. Right now, what we have in corporate land is an 8.84% tax on corporations that's flat. Google pays it as same as your mom and pop store when you go and buy something at the local grocery store, right? Or any corporation in the state. So you have a flat tax for corporations. You have a personal income tax that has progressive rates. There's no reason why that has to be the way it is. It's just simply we make choices that is the way it currently is. There was a proposal in the state Senate not just 3 years ago to actually change this. And it actually had some legs. It didn't get across the finish line, but there are opportunities out there to do something on this front. Now, what's interesting is that this diversify and stabilize revenue sources, when we wrote the report, we were really focused on a couple things that I thought were really important to focus on. And honestly, I had zero faith and confidence that there would be movement on it. And both of these things happened in the last, within the last month, we had a major, huge, I would argue, move on revenue. Broadening sales taxes, taxing digital products. Now, it's technical, it's not all digital products, but we had a huge move. We are now, on January 1st, in the state of California, going to tax the sale of digital software in the state of California. That is a massive, massive difference, where before, there were no taxes on digital sales, none. This tax will probably, Gary, it's Salesforce, right? Selling digital products, selling software, right? These are the big ticket items. This will bring in the 28-29 year, it's going to bring in $900 million for the state and $1.1 billion for locals. That's not chump change. That's real money. And it also puts on the table more of these possibilities in terms of taxing where there's growth in our economy, right? The other one was huge is that tax expenditures, it's a very wonky term for a tax credit or a tax break. Sometimes people know them as tax credits for oftentimes the largest and most profitable corporations in the state. We have a research and development tax credit. That tax credit is actually 80% goes to corporations making more than $10 million a year. What happened is that we actually put a cap on tax expenditures in the state of California that starting in 2029 will mean $4 billion a year in additional revenue for the state. And this cap it's a huge deal. Like it was, I think what I understand, it was pushed by the legislature. And so we had movement, is my point. I would put on the table, one thing that we have in the state of California is a massive amount of property wealth, but we don't tax it. And it's not just property wealth of individuals, it's property wealth of corporations. So you could tax commercial and industrial property at different rates than you tax residential property. It's called the split roll. We've attempted it. It lost by 1.5 points in 2020. That's one opportunity. You could establish a statewide tax on property, on commercial and industrial property, just a state rate. If you did that, we did a calculation, we got data, it was like, you do that at 0.5% on commercial and industrial property, you get $10 billion a year. So there are opportunities out there. Now, the thing we say is that each option has trade-offs. You got to make choices, right? But we try to put various of them on the table. The last thing I'll stop, I know I'm getting called. Thank you, Brianna, we're done. We often hear California is the 4th largest economy in the world. It's a very diverse economy. It has lots of different places, lots of resources. There are many resources out there. It's not that we don't have them. The question is, what are we thinking about in terms of trying to get them? The constraints are real. It's not to say, like, this isn't easy, but evidence just shows that they're not immovable. We actually have made progress on these items. The cost of inaction is serious. Revenues are important for capacity. When you hear that word capacity, it's a bland term. One of them is resources. If you don't have the resources, you don't have capacity. That's you're going to have overcrowded classrooms. I would suggest also you have stressed families, which oftentimes is not paid attention to. And lastly, we have tools. There are lots of options. The question is, which one do we want to think about, and do we actually talk about this, even talk about it, which is part of why the report's out there. So with that, I know I went over time. I apologize, and I hope we can engage in a conversation about various things that were in the report.